All right, so let's go ahead and get ourselves started for this morning. This is Political Science 1, class number 30018. My name is Paul Savoy. It is Tuesday. It is the 12th of May, 2020, and this is our regular weekly Zoom class meeting. And over the next 45 minutes or so, we are going to accomplish several things. First up, in just a couple of minutes, I'm going to go ahead and give you a couple of important announcements and reminders about the class in general, upcoming assignments, things to think about, that sort of thing. Then after I do that and take any general questions that you have about the class, I will go ahead and see if you have any questions about the material that you've been learning about over the past week and the notes that I highlighted for you during last week's Zoom meeting, and that is dealing with the presidency. And then finally, I'll spend the rest of our time together today kind of highlighting, previewing some of the important points in the notes for the next section of material that you will be learning about between this coming Thursday and next Thursday. And that is dealing with the last of the three national government branches that the framers created back in 1787. This time in Article 3 of the Constitution, we'll talk a little bit about the courts, the federal judicial branch. And in particular, we'll talk a little bit about our changing perceptions of the power of the federal courts, especially the U.S. Supreme Court. We'll understand how and why that evolution has happened. And also, we'll talk a little bit about an extremely important power that the federal courts, especially the U.S. Supreme Court, invented for itself back in 1803 in a very famous case called Marbury versus Madison. So we'll talk about the content, process, and the long-lasting impact of this invented power that we call judicial review. And that's pretty much what we're going to be getting ourselves into for today. So first off, just a few announcements and reminders. First of all, of course, remember that the assignment that you are currently working on dealing with the presidency, that latest discussion forum post, is due this coming Thursday. That is May 14th at 11:59 p.m. Of course, remember that due date does not count the automatic 3-day or 72-hour grace period that you are given for all of your assignments in this class. So please keep that due date in mind, plus the grace period, of course. Also, please remember, if you have not yet submitted your copy of test number 2 to me as yet, you need to do so. So please, if you haven't done that yet, please send me an email or a Canvas message ASAP. Let me know what's going on with you. Let's make some arrangements for you to get that test to me so that you can at least get some of the points that you would be entitled to for that test. Other reminders, of course, if you haven't had a chance to take a look at the main schedule for the class lately, remember that we're actually getting fairly close to the end of the semester. I know that may seem strange, especially since we've had to move online for the rest of the semester. It kind of feels like the semester has been going on for at least a couple of years, but amazingly enough, we are actually getting towards the end. And since we are getting towards the end, you need to remember that the big assignment of the semester, that is the Student's Choice Project, will be coming due in about 16 days from now. So that would be Thursday, May 28th at 11:59 p.m. Also, of course, plus that automatic 3-day or 72-hour grace period. So if you if you've been working on your Student's Choice Project, but kind of put it aside in favor of other priorities, other assignments, other classes, whatever it is, you might want to start getting back to that Student's Choice Project so you're not waiting until the last minute to complete it and submit it. And if at this point you have still not yet begun your Student's Choice Project, now would be a good time to get going with that. The assignment guidelines for the Student's Choice Project can be found by going to our class Canvas homepage, clicking on the assignments link in the left-hand side main menu, and then once you get there, scroll down to the link labeled Student's Choice Project, click on that, and take a look at it. Remember, once we made the full-time move to online in this class, I did go ahead and revise the Student's Choice Project. I lowered the minimum page limit, especially for those of you who initially were doing the BLAST service learning option for the project. And of course, BLAST got shut down when we all began to shelter in place at home. So I changed the minimum page requirement for everybody, but especially for those who started out doing BLAST. So make sure you take a look at that. I also added a couple of additional project topics for you to work on that I thought were particularly suited to our period of sheltering in place. So please take a careful look at those guidelines. And if you have any questions about the Student's Choice Project assignment, please do feel free to send me an email, to send me a Canvas message, or to Zoom in and ask me a question during my twice weekly virtual student hours on Zoom. And remember, those virtual student hours take place every Monday and Wednesday afternoon from 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And to get into those one-on-one Zoom appointments, all you have to do is go to our class Canvas homepage, scroll down past the picture, go down to the section labeled Basic Course Information, and there you will find both the Zoom link for my virtual student hours on Mondays and Wednesdays, as well as the password that you would need to provide to gain access to those twice weekly virtual student hour sessions on Zoom. And also remember, if you need to talk to me one-on-one via Zoom, but neither of those times, Monday and Wednesday afternoons, work for your schedule, no problem. We can work around it. Send me a Canvas message or an email, and we can work out a day and time where I can set up a custom one-on-one Zoom appointment for us, and we can talk about whatever you need to talk about. All right. So I think that is it as far as announcements and reminders go regarding the class. So at this point, before we move on to ask about any specific questions that you might have about the presidency or the discussion forum post assignment on the presidency, let me ask, are there any general questions about anything having to do with the class before we go ahead and move forward for this morning? And at any point to ask a question or make a comment, please feel free to unmute your mic and ask, or if you'd rather, put your question or your comment in the group chat and I can acknowledge it and deal with it from there as well. So any general questions about anything having to do with the class at this time? Anybody? Okay, so seeing and hearing none, let's go ahead and move on. And so if you remember during our Zoom session for this class last week, we spent the bulk of our time going over a couple of highlights in the notes that I posted for you last week, dealing with the current subject that you are learning about, that is the presidency. And of course, the class notes that I gave you for the presidency, as well as the assigned readings and the crash course videos, are all designed to help you be able to respond to the current discussion forum post assignment on the presidency that, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, is due, not counting the grace period, of course, this coming Thursday at 11:59 p.m. Now, let me just remind you about the couple of really big highlights that I mentioned last week regarding the notes on the presidency from Canvas. And the first main point that I highlighted was the fact that, we as folks living in the United States today perceive the power of the presidency and the relative power of the presidency when compared with Congress and the courts in a dramatically different way than the framers did when they created the Constitution back in 1787. If you recall, last week we said that today, most of us see the president as being the most powerful and the most potentially dangerous of the three national government branches, whereas the framers themselves, back when they were creating the presidency, along with the rest of the Constitution back in 1787, really weren't all that worried about the president becoming too powerful, spinning out of control, abusing their authority, that sort of thing. And we talked about a couple of reasons last week why the framers really weren't all that concerned about future presidents spinning out of control. But, here's the thing, as we emphasized last week, because the framers were so relatively unconcerned about the potential for future presidents to abuse their authority and potentially threaten American democracy or threaten the people's natural rights or something like that, the framers really didn't sweat the details when they created the structure and function and powers and process of the presidency in Article 2 of the Constitution. So as we said last week, the framers, really didn't carefully specify what the president could and could not do in Article 2. They didn't sweat the details with Article 2 in the same way that they did with Congress in Article 1, because they just didn't see the need to box the president in the same way that they did with regard to Congress. And that's how we got from there to here, right? That's how we got from the framers not really fearing abuse of power by future presidents to where we are today, where a lot of us do fear abuse of power by presidents and can point to actual real examples of presidential abuse of power going back a number of decades, talking about folks like former President Richard Nixon and that sort of thing. And so that's, again, how we got from there to here. Because since the framers didn't sweat the details in Article 2, modern presidents, beginning with Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s, were able to essentially invent new powers for themselves by taking advantage of that lack of detail in Article 2. And so, for example, if you had a chance to go through and look in more detail at all of the presidency notes that I posted for you on Canvas last week, especially if you look at the last section of the presidency notes, where I give you a pretty detailed discussion of each of the 5 main functions or roles of the president. Within that discussion, I give you at least 2 examples of what I like to refer to as invented powers. That is, powers that were not specifically mentioned by the framers anywhere in the Constitution, but have been invented by modern presidents taking advantage of that lack of detail in Article 2. And the specific examples of these invented powers that I'm talking about in the chief executive function of the presidency, this thing called the executive order, which basically allows presidents to make laws without Congress. And then in the chief diplomat function of Congress, this thing that we call the executive agreement that allows a president to have to avoid going through Senate approval to get a treaty, and instead allows the president to directly reach an understanding with the head of a foreign government about something that they want to do and avoid having to get congressional approval. So these are some very tricky ways that more modern presidents have used to dramatically increase their level of power and authority, as my dog chimes in the background. He's in complete agreement with this, right? He likes presidential power, I think. So that's the first main point that we really emphasized during our weekly Zoom meeting last week. And the other really important point that I highlighted from the presidency notes for you last week, we looked at one of the major reasons why, not the only reason, but a very significant reason why some presidents out of the 45 that we've had in our history under the Constitution have been a lot more successful and a lot more effective than other presidents, right? We talked about the fact that while there are lots of different factors that could potentially weigh in as to why some presidents in our history, like a George Washington or an Abraham Lincoln or a Franklin Delano Roosevelt or somebody like that, why some presidents are being seen by historians and others as being really good, really effective at doing their jobs and addressing really difficult situations that the country was facing during their presidency. Why are some presidents so much better at doing this than others? And one of the main factors that we talked a little bit about last week, and it's highlighted in section 2 of your presidency notes was the fact that the most successful and effective presidents in our history were able to be successful and effective in part because they were able to build and maintain high levels of public support. In other words, our most successful and effective presidents have been those who a large majority of American voters perceived as being really good at their jobs, as trying to do really good things for the country. And that makes them more successful overall. Why? Well, because as we talked about last week, no president can effectively put in place their agenda for the country, what they want to do to help the country. They can't do it all by themselves. Even with invented powers like the executive order, a president is only going to be as successful as good as their relationship is with the US Congress. A president needs Congress to give that president the laws, rules, regulations, programs, etc., that president needs to fulfill their agenda for the country. And remember what we said, sometimes presidents do not have good relations with Congress, even if Congress is controlled by majorities from the president's own party. So what's a president to do? How is the president going to get the job done? How is the president going to get the needed programs, policies, laws, etc. from Congress if Congress doesn't want to work with the president? If Congress hates the president or has policy disagreements with the president, how is this going to work? Well, as we said, really popular presidents with high levels of public job approval are able to use that public popularity as leverage to get Congress to do what the president wants them to do. Why? Because the president can tell the American people, hey, go tell your members of Congress to cooperate with me, to give me the laws that I need to help the country, and tell them if they don't, maybe you're not going to vote for them next time. So a highly popular president can really threaten the reelection obsession of members of Congress and cause members of Congress to cooperate with the president that they wouldn't ordinarily want to work with or support. So those are the major points that we talked about from the notes on the presidency from last week. Hopefully, since last week, you've had a chance to go through those notes in more detail. And hopefully, you've also had the chance to go through the assigned readings on the presidency, as well as watch the crash course videos that I gave you for the presidency. So at this point, are there any questions about any of the information regarding the presidency from any of those sources? Or do you have any questions about the discussion forum post on the presidency that is coming due this Thursday at 11:59 p.m.? So any questions or comments about anything having to do with the presidency? And you can either unmute your mic or put your question or your comment in the group chat. So anything at all dealing with the presidency at this time. Anyone?
No questions right now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Reese. Anybody else? Okay, great. So given that, let's go ahead and shift our attention to the topic, the information that you're going to be learning about for the next week for the discussion forum post that is due a week from this coming Thursday, so the 21st of May at 11:59 p.m., not counting the grace period, right? And so yesterday I went ahead and I opened up the module on our Canvas homepage for the judicial branch, the courts, gave you a copy of the class notes for the judiciary, which we're going to spend a few minutes going over right now. Also gave you 3 crash course videos dealing with the courts, especially with the U.S. Supreme Court, that I want you to look at between now and next Thursday. And also on the assignment outline and reading schedule page on our Canvas site, also gave you some assigned reading for the judicial branch, as well as my dog chimes in with further suggestions for reading, I guess. Who knows? But anyway, I do want to go ahead and highlight what I see as being kind of the two most important points that I bring up in the notes on Canvas for the judicial branch. So if possible, hopefully you can have a copy of the judicial branch notes up and available for you to look at as we go through this. So let's go do that. Pardon me for looking away as I pull up those notes up on my other screen here. There we go. So again, think about what we've said in very general terms about both Congress and the president over the past couple of weeks. Remember, we said that in both cases, with both Congress and the president, the framers ended up having very different perceptions, attitudes, understandings about each of these two branches as they were creating them in Philadelphia in 1787. Very different understandings than how we perceive Congress and the presidency today. And so in both of those previous discussions, we've talked a lot about how we got from there to here, right? How we got from the framers' attitudes towards a particular branch and how that evolved into how we see that particular branch today. And if you remember, in both cases, how we got from there to here is best explained by the framers' actions, how the framers acted based on their perceptions of that particular branch and what the framers ended up doing about each branch in the Constitution itself. And guess what? We see that same pattern of how we got from there to here continue in talking about the last of the three national government branches that the framers created, this time in Article 3 of the Constitution, and that is the federal judicial branch, the federal court system in the United States. And guess what? We today in 2020, not surprisingly, have a very different attitude about the federal court system than the framers did. So if you take a look at point 1, the very top of the judiciary notes that I gave you on our modules page on Canvas, you'll see that the framers had a very specific attitude towards the courts that we do not share today. Specifically, as it says there, the framers believed that the judiciary would by far, not even close, would be the least dangerous of the three national government branches, as well as being the least powerful of the three national government branches. The framers believed that there was pretty much zero chance of the federal courts ever becoming too powerful, ever abusing that power in a way that threatens the people's natural rights or upsets the balance within separation of powers generally. The framers were not scared about the courts. And because the framers were not scared about the courts, and for another important reason that we'll talk about in a few minutes, the framers spent barely any time or detail at all in creating Article 3. The framers said almost nothing about the structure, function, process, and powers of the federal courts. Article 3 is so brief and so vague that some constitutional historians have only half-jokingly suggested that the framers quickly created Article 3 of the Constitution one night during happy hour in one of the many pubs they used to frequent in downtown Philadelphia during the Constitutional Convention. And the reason why they say that is because they argue that Article 3 is so brief and so vague that it probably could have been written on a cocktail napkin. Now, that's fun to think about. It's fun to believe that's what happened. Did that happen in reality? Probably not. But bottom line, Article 3 is barely there. It says very little, and very little specifically about the structure, function, powers, and process of the courts. And there's two reasons for that. There are two specific reasons that I lay out in point capital A and point capital B in section 1 of your notes. The first reason, not surprisingly, is that the framers just weren't worried about the courts ever becoming too powerful, ever potentially spinning out of control and abusing their authority. Why? Well, take a look at what it says there in point capital A. And I quote the framers directly, and the very fancy formal language that they used as a matter of course in the 1780s. The framers didn't fear the courts spinning out of control because they said the courts have, quote, neither the power of the purse nor the power of the sword. And you might be sitting back and thinking, okay, wait a minute, what does that mean in plain English? What do they mean by the power of the purse and the power of the sword? And why do the courts not possess either of those things? Well, again, that's just the fancy, flowery language that the framers and others used in the United States during this period of time. This is much more, quote unquote, the King's English than the type of English that we speak today in the year 2020. So let me do a little translating for you. The first part of this, the framers didn't fear the courts because they didn't have the power of the purse. In other words, the framers didn't fear the courts spinning out of control because the courts did not control their own annual budget. The courts themselves did not control their own source of funding. Congress does, then and now, right? Because one of the main functions of Congress is to allocate the budget, is to determine the funding for all the various parts of the US national government, including the federal courts. So the framers said, look, the courts are never going to become too powerful. They're never going to spin out of control. They're never going to abuse their authority because guess what? If they try, it'll be easy for Congress to stop them in their tracks. All Congress has to do is eliminate their budget, pull their funding. The courts have to close down. They can't operate. And if they can't operate, they certainly can't abuse their power. So the framers saw this as a very big fail-safe preventing abuse of power by the judicial branch. That's what we mean when we say that Congress doesn't have the power of the purse. Now, the other part of that statement, that that the courts also don't have the power of the sword, what that means in 20th century or 21st century English is that the courts do not have the power to enforce their own decisions once they make them. So for example, let's say the US Supreme Court issues a ruling in a particular case. They cannot do anything. They have no power to ensure that the parties to the case actually obey what the court's decision says, okay? The courts cannot enforce their own decisions. Now, based on our knowledge of the three branches, based on our understanding of separation of powers, if the courts can't enforce their own decisions, who in the national government is responsible for enforcing national government court decisions and national government laws and treaties with foreign governments? Well, it's the president, right? Part of the president's chief executive function, as stated vaguely in Article 2 of the Constitution. So again, the framers said, look, the courts are never going to spin out of control. They're never going to become too powerful because let's say the Supreme Court decides to make a decision that attempts to steal power from one of the other branches. Well, the president can stop that immediately. The president can simply refuse to enforce the court's decision, and there's nothing the court can do about it. They're stuck. So you can see, in a sense, that the framers did have a good reason for not fearing the court spinning out of control. But as we'll see in a few minutes, it wasn't enough. So at this point, any questions about what we mean when we say that the courts have neither the power of the purse nor the power of the sword? Questions or comments about that or anything that we've said so far about the federal judicial branch? Are we good? We're making sense. I have a thumbs up from Reese. Any questions? Okay, so, but guess what? As I talk about in section B, or in point B of section 1, there is a second reason why the framers did not see the need to put a lot of detail and specifics into Article 3 of the Constitution. Why they said almost nothing about the structure and function and process of the courts. And here it is. The framers just automatically assumed that the US federal court system would end up being pretty much a duplicate or copy of the British court system. Now, think about that for a second. Let that point sink in for a moment. Now, as you're thinking about that, right, that the framers just automatically assumed that the US court system would take on the structure and function of the British court system, and thus they didn't need to put a lot of detail into Article 3, because why reinvent the wheel? Something about that statement should bother you. At first, you should be thinking, well, what Savoy just said about the framers assuming the courts would just take on the British model, that sounds really inconsistent with other stuff that Savoy was talking about in class back when we were still face-to-face, back early on in the semester when we were talking about the creation of our current Constitution in 1787. But guess what? It's not inconsistent. I'll explain, but let me give you some background. Because remember, way back when, in the beginning of the semester, when we were still meeting regularly on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the T building, remember I told you, and I gave you several examples of how in designing the new governmental system of the United States under this new Constitution that was being written in 1787, the framers took many steps to make sure that our governmental system in the US would be as different, as distinct as it could possibly be from the British governmental system, right? And remember, I talked about several examples of this. I talked about the fact that our current Constitution has separation of powers, but the British system has fusion of powers, right? The opposite method of organization. I talked about the fact that the US Constitution has federalism to frame the relationship between the national and state governments, but the British system does the opposite. It has what we call a unitary system of government, where the national government is the only sovereign power in the country. And I said the reason for that at the time was that the framers wanted to do everything that they could to make sure that our new system of government under our new Constitution would not at all look like the British model. Why? Because they were afraid of the British model for the most part. They were afraid that if we followed the British model of governance in the United States, we would end up creating a national government that would be way too powerful and that would abuse its power in the same way that the British government did back when we were all British citizens living in 13 American colonies. So the framers said, no, not going to do it, right? And yet now, here I am, quite a few weeks later, telling you, well, yeah, that's true, but the framers did assume that the federal court system would be pretty much an exact copy, with a few variations, of the British court system. Now, am I being inconsistent? Have I forgotten what I talked about earlier in the semester? Have I had too much caffeine this morning? No. There is no inconsistency. And let me explain why. For the framers, the British court system was the only part of the British government that the framers actually liked and supported and trusted. Why? Because back before the American Revolution, back when we were still a series of 13 relatively disconnected British colonies, the British court system was the only element of the British government that treated the American colonists equally. just like, and fairly, just like any other British citizen living anywhere around the world in the far-flung British Empire of the time. So that British citizens living in the 13 American colonies got the same equal fair treatment as a British citizen living in the center of London, right? No difference. That's why the framers liked and trusted and supported the British judicial model. Even as the British king was persecuting and taking away the basic freedoms of American colonists, and as the British Parliament was doing the same, the British courts were continuing to treat American colonists fairly, just like any other British citizen. And that's the main reason why, while the framers tried to make most of our government as distinct, as different as possible from the British model, the one major exception was the court system. The framers wanted the US court system to take on the structure and function of the British model because they admired it for its fairness, for its ability to equally treat all individuals in society. Okay? Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Okay, so a question or clapping? So I get, oh, thumbs up. Okay, that's good. I like clapping too. That's a good thing. I don't know that what I said was actually clap worthy, but you know, I'll take it. I'll take whatever I can get, right? Okay, so that's the difference. And that's why the framers decided, you know, it's fine. We don't need to put a lot of detail into Article 3. We're just going to follow the British model. And Article 3 is barely there, right? Just to give you an example of how vague Article 3 is, it says there shall be one U.S. Supreme Court and whatever other inferior courts Congress chooses to create. So the framers said, look, for right now, small country, not a lot of stuff going on. Sure, there needs to be a federal court, the U.S. Supreme Court. Great. But we probably don't need any other levels of courts in the federal system right now. Now, we may need them in the future, right? So we'll leave it up to Congress. Congress at some point in the future can decide if they need to add any additional levels of courts below the U.S. Supreme Court. That's vague, right? In fact, Article 3 is so vague that the framers didn't even bother to specify how many judges should serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. They left that decision up to Congress as well. And that's why, if you look across U.S. history, the number of Supreme Court judges has changed over time because Congress has changed its mind on this issue over time. So originally, Congress said, well, we're going to have 6 judges on the U.S. Supreme Court. And that, I still don't understand that decision, right? Why would you put an even number of judges on a court? What happens if they're trying to decide a particular case and they tie 3-3 on the decision? You know, what do? Do they flip a coin? Do they play rock, paper, scissors to figure out the result? I mean, that never made sense to me. I don't know what Congress was smoking at the time. Well, I probably don't want to know what Congress was smoking at the time either, right? Now we know, and for like the last, century and a half or so, I appreciate the laugh in the chat. Thank you. Congress has set the U.S. Supreme Court at 9 members, which probably makes a bit more sense having an odd number. But anyway, and my dog is chiming in, of course, because he liked the joke as well. Sure. But anyway, barely any detail in Article 3. Now you're thinking, okay, well, fine, Savoy, why do you keep emphasizing this point? Well, remember what we were talking about last week about the presidency. Remember how we said last week that the framers didn't sweat the details in Article 2. They left the details about the presidency fairly vague. And what happened as a result of that? Modern presidents took advantage of that lack of detail in Article 2 to essentially invent new powers for themselves because of that lack of detail. Well, guess what? A similar thing happened to the federal judiciary. But the federal courts didn't wait nearly as long as presidents did to start inventing powers for themselves through the lack of detail in Article 3. If you take a look at your notes, specifically if you scroll down to the point capital E under 1 in your notes, I describe this massive power that the U.S. Supreme Court essentially invented for itself in 1803 in one of its most famous decisions in a case called Marbury versus Madison. And in that case, they invented a power that has a huge impact on us throughout our history, but continues to have a huge impact on us as folks living in the United States today. And I'll explain why in just a minute. But first of all, let's talk about the invented power that the U.S. Supreme Court essentially created for itself in this 1803 case of Marbury versus Madison. What they created is kind of a two-pronged power called judicial review, okay? And I give you a lot of detail about judicial review in the notes. You can look at that later. But for right now, here are the basics, right? Part 1 of judicial review. The courts gave themselves the exclusive authority to interpret the actual words of the Constitution, to tell all the rest of us in the country, including the president and Congress, what the words in various parts of the Constitution mean in reality, what they actually mean in practice. Because remember, you know, a lot of the words of the Constitution, it's either very fancy language or it's very vague language. And so the court said, look, someone's got to make sense of this. Someone has to be the final authority on what the words of the Constitution mean in reality, mean in practice. And the courts essentially formally gave that power to themselves in this Marbury versus Madison decision. Now think about it. That is a huge power in itself. Because remember, as we've been talking about since the very first day of the semester, everything that government does in the United States is predicated on by what the Constitution says. Everything that we do politically in the United States is governed in the end by the U.S. Constitution. So whoever gets the job of interpreting the words of the Constitution gets a whole lot of power. Okay? So, that's part 1. But guess what? The second part of judicial review provides even more authority that the courts invented for themselves. Because the second element of judicial review basically says that once the courts interpret some part of the Constitution, some phrase, some sentence, some paragraph, whatever it is, once they interpret some part of the Constitution, the court then has the ability to strike down any action by government that the court believes conflicts with their interpretation of the Constitution. So if the court believes that any act of the president, any act of Congress, or any act of the 50 state governments conflicts with their interpretation of some part of the Constitution, the courts strike that action down. It's dead, it's gone, it's if it never existed in the first place. Folks, think about that. That is huge power that the courts invented for themselves. And the court's ability to exercise both parts of this judicial review power has resulted in the courts historically being able to significantly transform our lives as folks living in the United States. It's a really big deal. And what especially makes it a big deal is that, as we'll talk more about next week, just about every one of our basic freedoms that we have as folks living in the United States, every one of our civil liberties and civil rights, which we'll talk more about next week, are found in different parts of the U.S. Constitution. Now think about this. If all of our basic freedoms are listed in different parts of the Constitution through judicial review, that means it is the job of the courts, and in the end, it is the job of the U.S. Supreme Court to tell us what our freedoms are and how far they go and how government can limit them and when government can limit them. Because of judicial review, it is the courts that define the freedoms that we have as folks living in the United States. And folks, I cannot think of a more immense power than that. And as we'll talk more about next week, because the courts interpret our freedoms through this judicial review process, they sometimes will reinterpret them, meaning that the Supreme Court's interpretation of some of our freedoms, a lot of our freedoms, most all of our freedoms have changed, have evolved dramatically over time. That's why up until the mid-1950s, from the end of the Civil War to the mid-1950s, it was legal under the Constitution to have separate segregated public facilities like public schools based on race. That prior to 1954, you could have one set of public schools for Caucasian students and another set of inferior public schools for students of color. But after 1954, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. Based on our interpretation of the Constitution, if you separate public facilities based on race, you are denying some people equal treatment and equal protection under the law. So even if the actual words of the Constitution don't change over time, how the courts choose to interpret those words through judicial review can change over time. And that's why the courts through judicial review have had a transformational impact on our lives in the United States. Does that make sense? And we're going to talk a lot more about that and how it relates to our freedoms next week when we talk about civil liberties and civil rights. But does that make sense for right now? Any questions, comments, problems, complaints, etc., about judicial review? Okay, so I'm about 3 minutes over. Let me briefly wrap things up and get you on out of here. Please remember the discussion forum post on the presidency due this Thursday, May 14th at 11:59 p.m., not counting the grace period, of course. The next discussion forum assignment dealing with the judicial branch due a week from this coming Thursday. That would be the 21st of May at 11:59 p.m. Again, not counting the grace period. And remember, Students' Choice Project due 16 days from now, submitted to me via Canvas, Thursday, May 28th at 11:59 p.m. Again, plus the 3-day grace period, right? So make sure that you are keeping up with all that stuff. Remember, questions, comments, anything having to do with this class or anything that you think I can help you with, send me an email, send me a Canvas message, stop by during my virtual student hours on Monday or Wednesday afternoons, or send me a Canvas message or an email, and we can set up an individual one-on-one appointment on Zoom to talk about whatever you need to talk about. And please feel free to reach out to me whenever you need to. I am here not just to help you with your success in this class, but to help you successfully navigate and live through this really awful time that we are all dealing with at right now. Remember, you're strong and you're not alone. I'm here for you. I've got your back. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll talk to you all soon. Be safe. Take care.
Thank you. Have a nice
Bye-bye.
day.
You're welcome. Thanks, you too.